Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 5 of our lecture series on modern metaphysics. So far we've studied the philosophies of George Berkeley, of John Locke, of David Hume, and now we're going to look at Immanuel Kant. So I'm not going to give a historical background of Kant as an Enlightenment thinker. We did that during our ethics unit. Instead, what I'm going to do is jump right into the philosophy, but I want to do a little bit of review first, okay? In the 18th century, there were two camps of philosophers. On the one side, you had the empiricists, who thought that if you want to get knowledge, you have to experience the world. If you want to know what is the third planet from the sun, or whether or not the sky is blue, or if all bachelors are unhappy, or how big an elephant is, or whether or not evolution is true, you have to go and check, maybe take some measurements or do an experiment. On the other side, you have the rationalists, who thought that the only way to get real knowledge was to figure it out. You can know, without collecting data or doing any experiments, that 2 + 2 = 4, for example, or that all bachelors are unmarried. These are things that rationalists believed you could know for certain. The reasoning behind their claim is that our senses can deceive us. We can be hallucinating. We can see things differently. And we're always filtering what we see via our imperfect sense faculties through our narrow subjective perspectives, and we really never see things in themselves, or as the Buddhists would say, things from their own side. So Kant synthesizes these two views, arguing essentially that there's truth in both outlooks. And so we move on to the next slide. This kind of just details Kant's Transcendental Idealism. That's what his theory is called. Kant's theory of Transcendental Idealism states that both reason and experience are necessary to understand the world. And of course, this argument comes from his work, The Critique of Pure Reason. Okay, so again, Kant's approach is known as Transcendental Idealism. And a few terms to get out of the way. For Kant, he refers to direct sensations as intuitions. And he refers to our ability to have and use concepts as our understanding. So whereas people like Hume would say impressions and complex ideas versus simple or complex impressions, Kant's simplifying it even more. And he's calling direct sensations intuitions and our ability to have and use concepts understanding. So here you can already see the divide that Kant's trying to bridge between rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism being closer to the understanding, empiricism being knowledge formation through direct sensation, through intuitions, so via our experience of the world. And so Kant's big contribution to philosophy is basically this claim in bullet point number 3. His point is, look, folks, without concepts, okay, we would not know our intuition or our sensation was of a book. So without rationalism, so that's rationalism right there. Without concepts, we wouldn't even be able to make sense of the intuitions of objects that we have, like of a book. It would be meaningless to experience an object out in the world that is a book without knowing what a book is, what it's used for, what it does, how you might interact with it, okay? So without concepts, right, our experiences are meaningless. And without intuitions, we would never know that there were books at all. So that's the empiricist point there that he's giving some credit to. Without the fact that we can have sense experiences, that we can experience the world, but without intuitions, we wouldn't even be able to have any thoughts, concepts, or anything like that about books in the first place. So the two sides need each other, right? Empiricism and rationalism fit together well. And here's an actual quote from Kant. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuition without concepts are blind. Only from their union can cognition arise. So Kant's Copernican revolution is this. Look, empiricists think that the mind is like a blank slate, it's like an empty bucket. It just passively receives, records, then organizes impressions. So the external world shapes our perception, while knowledge just conforms to the objects of the external world, and really the external world guides the process. Kant's big breakthrough was no, objects conform to our knowledge. For sense data to be experienced in the first place, the mind has to impose a rational structure on our experience. Objects we see already have their own independent structure. They're things in themselves. So Kant is not an idealist. He's not claiming that the only thing that exists is mind. What he's saying is there is an external world out there. We can't know things from their own side. We can't know things in themselves as they exist outside of our perception. We have to see them and filter them in and through our narrow, subjective perspectives. We have to see them and experience them in and through our sense faculties. So while the objects that we are experiencing have their own independent structure in the external world that we can't access, what we do is our mind imposes a structure on the world, right? And we see reality by imposing that, so as Kant would put it, the formulating categories of our mind give rise to and shape the experiences that we have. So experience is a product of both what comes from the external world, the mind doesn't create this, but we can't fully know it, and the structure the mind imposes on the world, okay? So a good way of thinking about this, right, is this this painting that I'm putting up here called The Dining Room. This is a painting created with dabs of paint in a style called pointillism. The dining room scene is a collection of different colored dots. That's what it really is. If you zoom in, if you look up close, if you get close enough to it, you'll see the dots. You won't see the whole picture. It won't make sense. So the mind, what the mind does with perception is the mind organizes those dots into meaningful patterns of forms and objects that we're familiar with and interprets this two-dimensional canvas as three-dimensional space. And of course, the artist is doing that too, and the artist has a greater plan in mind. The artist knows what forms we'll recognize, right? So for Kant, all experience is a matter of the mind imposing its structure on the world by organizing bare sense data into meaningful objects within a temporal and spatial matrix. So why do we experience the world as we do? The way that we see the world, the way that reality looks for us is really a function of our evolutionary imperatives. We experience the world as we do. We have the senses and sense organs that we have as a consequence of evolution through random mutation and natural selection. We tend to think that we look at the world and that it just presents itself to us. And the sort of default pedestrian view is to believe that we see the world accurately. Naive realism. We see the world just the way that it is. The way things are out there, we're seeing them exactly how they are. But that's not true. This is why, for example, developing artificial intelligence systems that can actually see the world and act in it in a real way has proved to be a more difficult problem than people had originally supposed. People have been talking since the early 60s, basically promoting the idea that we would have speech to text or object recognition or robots that could exist in the world that would be able to interact in the world in a normal functional way, that these things were a couple of years away. And yet, while we do have now some fairly advanced robots, they're nowhere near where we thought they would be by this point. And that's because perceiving the world and figuring out how to act in it is not as easy as we originally thought it would be. It turns out the connection between perceiving and acting is not as disconnected as we originally thought. We tend to think that we perceive things the way that they are. We perceive the world out there the way that it really is, and then we have certain drives and imperatives, and we interact with the world as it is to fulfill those drives. But that's not actually how it works. The borders between things is not self-evident. It's also tied up strangely with the nature of your embodiment. For example, we tend to see things that are handy. We're evolutionary creatures. We perceive the world not as it is, but functionally. So to some degree, our brains are evolved to make the world manifest itself to us as a set of discrete, usable tools. They're discrete and usable because we have a certain biological platform. And that shapes how we see the world, what things our perception prioritizes. We have hands and mouths, and we walk in a bipedal manner. So it's logical for us to break the world up in a manner that makes operating in this body, maximally useful. But that doesn't mean that there's a straightforward one-to-one ratio between our perceptions of things and things in themselves. Quite the contrary. But the difference between Kant and someone like Berkeley is Berkeley is not even convinced that the world out there exists. He's an idealist. Kant says, oh yeah, the external world definitely exists, but you experience it in and through your imperfect sense faculties. You can't know things in themselves, things from their own side, right? But at the same time, for Kant, there are some concepts that you have in your head that you couldn't have got just by experiencing the world, but you also couldn't have just sat down and figured them out. And so this is where we're going to go back to the two kinds of knowledge. Just as a refresher, the two kinds of knowledge, if you remember, are a priori. A priori knowledge is knowledge obtained, confirmed, or justified independently of experience. So to know that 2 + 2 = 4, or that all bachelors are unmarried, you need not quote, you need not cite experience. It requires no empirical data to confirm those propositions. A posteriori knowledge, on the other hand, is knowledge obtained, confirmed, or justified via experience. So to take that all bachelors proposition, all the bachelors in the room are 6 feet tall, cannot be shown to be true apart from experience. That's something that would actually require you to point to all the bachelors in the room, measure them to know that they're 6 feet tall, so that you could confirm that knowledge. So let's look at another type of judgment, type of distinction that matters in philosophy, especially for Kant. There are two types of judgments. There are analytic propositions, so that's propositions whose truth depends solely on the meaning of its terms, propositions that are true or false by definition. All analytic judgments are a priori. So to know an analytic proposition, one need not consult experience. Instead, you would need merely to take the subject and extract from it the required predicate. So with analytic propositions, the predicate concept is contained in the subject concept. So to know if an analytic proposition is true, you simply have to examine the concept of the subject. If you find the predicate contained in it, then the judgment is true. You don't have to consult experience to determine whether all bachelors are unmarried is true. You just need to look at the subject concept, bachelors, and see if the predicate concept, unmarried, is contained within it. And in fact, it is. Unmarried is part of the definition of bachelor, and so it's contained within it. All bachelors are unmarried is true, but there's nothing you can point to in experience to confirm that truth. Okay? So basically, analytic propositions are tautological propositions, and I think the best way of defining synthetic propositions is that they're not. Okay, so synthetic propositions aren't analytic propositions. Okay, you'd actually need to point to something in the world to prove a synthetic proposition. They are not tautological. So if you look at this chart here, you have a priori, a posteriori on the left, and above you have analytic and synthetic, right? And so hopefully this will make sense, right? It would follow that all analytic propositions are a priori. So if you look at the square that a priori and analytic share, they both share bachelors are unmarried and 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4 is true prior to experience, right? And both of those claims are also claims that are definitional. They're tautologies, so they're analytic. So you could see how all analytic claims would be a priori, and so that makes sense, right? If you look down here in this category over here too, this is a posteriori. This is the box that a posteriori and synthetic share. Some swans are white. That's a posteriori truth because you'd have to discover that via experience. You'd have to point to that fact. You'd have to discover a white swan before you could definitively claim that. And then it's also synthetic because it's not an analytic, definitional, tautological claim. So these two should make sense, right? Okay. There is no such thing as a posteriori analytic, right? What would that even mean in the first place? By definition, analytic claims are not claims that are confirmed via experience. Their truth is not confirmed via experience. They're definitional. They're a priori. So you can't have analytic a posteriori. Just for example, the denial of an a priori analytic proposition would be a logical contradiction. The denial of an a posteriori truth is not a logical contradiction. You could imagine that white swans didn't exist, right? It just could have happened. That's easy to imagine. For example, here's an a posteriori synthetic truth. Mr. Hill is in this room right now. It just as easily could be the case that Mr. Hill is not in this room right now, and we talked about that in our lecture on Hume. Kant's big revolution in philosophy was claiming that there was such a thing as synthetic a priori truths. Are synthetic a priori truths possible? Is there such a thing as synthetic a priori propositions? And for someone like Kant, that would be something like space, time, the things that we project. So again, Kant's big innovation in philosophy was to say that space is an a priori intuition. Okay, so space, the distance between objects. In order to learn about things outside of me, I need to know that they're outside of me in space. And so I'm going to look at these bullet points here. How can I locate something outside of me without already knowing what outside of me means? And some knowledge of space has to be assumed before I can ever study space empirically. So a baby experiencing the world for the first time intuits space. He already has the concept of space in his head. He's born with it. That's part of the hardware. That's part of his original wiring. He couldn't have gotten it by experiencing the world. He can't look out there and say, oh, there's an object over here. Oh, and there's an object over here. Now I get what space is. He comes into the world seeing things in space. So this is something that Kant thought, for that reason, was a priori. We come into the world prior to experience with a conception of space, and that once we start having experiences, we reconstruct reality as objects in space. So he couldn't have gotten space by experiencing the world, but at the same time, you couldn't have just sat down and figured it out. It's not like 2 + 2 = 4 or all bachelors are unmarried. There's nothing definitionally true about space, and this should give you this should be a good explanation of why he thought space was proof of synthetic a priori. It had been traditionally assumed that you could only have a priori analytic propositions and a posteriori synthetic propositions. Kant's big revolution was to say that there is such a thing as synthetic a priori. And that's still very controversial today. Some people agree with him, some people don't. But Kant's point is that things like space, number, and time are built into us. Okay, but that they're not the same thing as 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, so space, number, time, those are things that are built in. Our brains are hardwired to experience the world in this way. So as soon as the baby is experiencing anything, she is experiencing it spatially. It's in the hardware. It's not software. It's built in. You have to experience the world like this. At the same time, 2 + 2 = 4, on the other hand, is true whether or not we exist, right? If there's such a thing as a bachelor, then the fact that bachelors are unmarried is a given. It's a tautology whether or not we exist. It's a hypothetical tautology. For example, whether or not we exist in the world ever, whether or not we ever existed, it would still be true. The proposition modus ponens, if P then Q, P therefore Q, that refers to relations of things, relations of ideas, as Hume would have put it. Okay, so this is what Kant called his transcendental argument. Right? His transcendental argument is that space is a priori. It does not belong to things in the world. Our experience of things in space is a feature of our sensibility. We project that onto the world. And he makes similar arguments about time. Now, the big question that Kant is grappling with, questions that philosophers like Descartes and Berkeley would have loved, is if you have to experience the world in this way, if you're hardwired to see space the way that you do and experience time the way that you do and sense the world the way that you do, then how do you know the world is really like that? Your synthetic a priori concepts are like essentially a pair of glasses that you can never take off. How do you know that space and time are really a part of the world and not just in your head? So again, Kant's big solution, right? Let me change slides here. Oh yes, and by the way, this slide is a good example of what they call naive realism. The idea that you just believe that you're a mind over here and that space exists out in reality, and that when you perceive things, you're just perceiving the external reality of objects existing in space, right? And then this next slide is more of the Kantian picture, that that's something that you project onto the world. Again, it's the formulating categories of your mind that give shape, that give form, that give rise to reality as you experience it. So that's Kant's big solution. He takes the world and he divides it into two halves. On the one hand, you've got the world as we experience it. And he called this, and I want to get into concepts now, he called this the phenomenal world. So the world as you experience it is the phenomenal world. Think of the term phenomena. On the other hand, you've got the world as it is in itself, independent of anybody's experience, that you could never fully know. And he called that the noumenal world. So the world that you're experiencing in and through your senses, that whole phrase, reality is perception, that's the phenomenal world. That's the world you're interacting in. You cannot but interact with that world. And then the world as it is outside of your perceptions, what Kant called things in themselves, that's the noumenal world. So the phenomenal and the noumenal. And we never experience the noumenal world, because as soon as you experience something, it's part of the phenomenal world. The noumenal world might not have space and time and all those things that are so fundamental to how we experience the phenomenal world. Okay? This all does lead us to ask the question, what is the nature of space? Is it a real thing that exists independently of our minds, or is it not a thing that exists independently of our mind? And, again, the conventional argument that Kant upends is space is real. It's part of the mind-independent world, and it exists independently of our knowledge of it. The mind-independent things that exist in a mind-independent world are arranged spatially. Right? Whether we exist or not, that's just the way things are. Space is just one more part of a world that's mind independent, that doesn't depend on us. Again, just to review here, then there's the Kantian view. Space is just something that our minds impose onto our representations of the world. More specifically, our minds have a capacity to sense things, and that capacity to sense things is what imposes spatial structure onto our representations of the world. And again, this is what Kant calls the transcendental ideality of space. He loved those weird concepts, those weird jargon words. And in this case, space is merely a form of our intuition. It's just a structure of our own minds. It's a structure our minds impose onto our representations. So in this case, you're not experiencing things in themselves. You're experiencing your representation. So another way of putting this is, we tend to think that we look out into the world and see things as they are. We're experiencing our perceptions of the way things are. So it's a representation that our mind invents of how things, now it's precipitated by and it's given rise to by the external world. We're just not experiencing it how it is. So that's what makes Kant different, is that Kant admits there is an external world out there. We're just not seeing it how it actually is. Okay? Why did he believe this? Why did he have such odd beliefs? Because he thought that geometrical knowledge is necessary and universal. It's plausible to think that a geometric truth, for example, the theorem that the interior angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees, everyone knows that. It's plausible to think that that isn't just contingently true. We know that that should be, the Pythagorean theorem should be, for example, a priori knowledge. It would only make sense. It cannot possibly prove to be wrong, right? Also, it's not the kind of truth that there are exceptions to, right? That the interior angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees is a truth that applies to all triangles without exception. There are external objects that exist independent of our own minds. then there are our minds. When we have knowledge of space, like our knowledge in geometry, all we really have knowledge of is the structure our own minds are imposing onto our representations. That's why our knowledge of space can be completely independent of experience. That's why it can be a priori. But it's also synthetic, remember, because it's not just a matter of tautological or definitional conceptual truths, right? It's not just a truth whose subject is contained within its predicate. And so here's a nice little chart here. Okay, one more time. Remember, this is your brain. This is your brain on Kant. And I like this diagram because it shows you the things in themselves. So this is the external world, whether or not you experience it or not. This is how it exists from its own side, without relation to your mind. And then here is the mind, right? And inside the mind, you'll notice the forms of space and time and what Kant called the formulating categories of our mind that enable us to have experiences that basically give shape to our experiences, that is. And you'll notice that we're having sensory intuitions, and this gives rise to the phenomenal world, okay? So that's a nice little diagram. And here's a quote from Kant. The forms of intuition, the logical functions of judgment, and the categories fix the necessary conditions of both experience and knowledge, but the actual content arises only from something independent of us. So the actual content arises from something independent of us, but the way that we experience it is not independent of us, obviously. Now, this is a very controversial thing. I'm presenting to you Kant's philosophy. It is more sophisticated, nuanced, updated than Hume or Locke. Kant takes the best of Descartes, Berkeley, Hume, and Locke, and comes up with his philosophy, Transcendental Idealism. Now, there are objections to this. I'll just end by referencing a couple of them. We won't go too into them because we're actually studying the philosophy here. The best objection, the objection that most people sort of have when they learn Kant's philosophy is something like the theory of relativity, right? According to the theory of relativity, the question of what geometry correctly describes the actual physical universe is a question we need to do a bunch of physics to answer. But physics is empirical. It's not a priori. So that makes geometry empirical too, since along with physics, geometry is justified, at least in part, by a bunch of experiments that you do in physics. And so if that's right, then Kant might be wrong. And so for the last 100 years or so, that's kind of been the most, that's something that that's an influential argument. That's something Kant's gonna have to grapple with. Now, let's keep in mind that Kant was a giant of a philosopher. He had his categorical imperative. He's famous for ethics. A lot of the things that he said in philosophy gave rise to other philosophers developing his philosophy further. I suppose the last objection that I like a lot, and I think that we can kind of work with, is the objection that says, okay, let's grant that Kant is right when he says that space is a form of intuition. It's something we project onto the world. It's a structure our own minds impose onto our representations of the world. Fine, but that doesn't mean that space isn't also a property of objects in a mind-independent world. Why can't it be both? Why can't space be both a form of intuition and a property of things in themselves? And of course, if it is a property of things in themselves, then of course, Kant's claim makes sense because we can't experience things in themselves as they actually are. So Kant's response, suppose that space were a property of things in themselves, what would our knowledge of that space be like? Since it would be knowledge of something out there in the mind-independent world, it would have to be empirical because the only way we can get knowledge of things that are mind-independent is through our senses. And so that's probably how Kant would respond, and that's going to bring up a whole nother discussion of the difference between knowledge and truth, because a lot of our discussion in epistemology is going to be about what kinds of knowledge that we can have, what kinds of propositions that we can put forth, what sorts of judgments we can make. Whereas in metaphysics, a lot of what we're talking about is what is actually true, not just what can we have knowledge of? What's actually true, independent of our minds. Whereas a lot of what knowledge is about is how we form knowledge. So I'm going to stop there. And what we'll do next week is we'll do a review of a lot of this. We'll do a review of, we'll get together and we'll do sort of a holistic, summative review of all of the different philosophers, starting with Berkeley, then of course Locke, then Hume, and then Kant. So we'll just have a discussion to make sure that everyone understands the different philosophies. And so that's it. I will talk to you soon.